to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book download. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. This week, I am going to go with a recommendation from listener and History of Rome Tour alumnus Scott, Persian Fire, The First World Empire and the Battle for the West, by Tom Holland, the story of the first invasion of Greece by the Persians in 480 BC. I personally read Holland's book on Julius Caesar, which was called Rubicon, and enjoyed it immensely. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 170, Attila Cometh. So last week, we saw how the myriad external pressures on the Roman Empire threatened to crack it up completely. But you may have noticed that these external pressures were falling unevenly on the two administrative halves of the empire. Sadly, by the mid-5th century, the Western Empire had become little more than a semi-functional confederation of barbarian tribes, with the imperial court at Ravenna sort of managing to cling at some semblance of its former prestige. Huge swaths of what had once been a truly united political entity were now autonomous zones run with little regard for the emperor's authority. In contrast, the Eastern Empire was doing pretty well for itself, all things considering. Since hitting rock bottom with the double blow of Julian's failed campaign against the Sassanids in the late 360s and the Gothic War of the late 370s, the East had actually rebounded nicely. I don't mean to imply that the 5th century was some kind of picnic for Constantinople, but you just don't see the succession of, and then they signed a treaty giving away Egypt, and then they signed a treaty giving away Greece, and then they signed a treaty giving away Cappadocia, the way you do with the West. But this week, the hammer, or should I say the scourge, is about to drop on the East as hard as it ever fell on the West. And though Constantinople isn't about to lose control of any land, it is going to cost them a pretty penny to hang on to what's theirs, because Attila the Hun drives a hard bargain. So you'll recall from last week that through the 430s and into the early 440s, the Eastern Empire was feeling secure enough in its own position that it was sending troops to the west to help contain the Vandals in North Africa. Now this was not a purely altruistic act. Vandals spreading across North Africa means Vandals might eventually reach Egypt, which is a totally unacceptable development. Plus, Vandal pirates disrupting shipping lanes was bad for everyone's business, both east and west alike. But though containing the Vandals was most certainly in the best strategic interests of Constantinople, it was in a long-term, preventative sort of way. That luxury of being able to think long-term came to a screeching halt in 441, when the Eastern Empire was simultaneously attacked on two fronts by its two biggest potential enemies, the Sassanids in the far east and the Huns in the north. Suddenly, stripping off soldiers from the Danube frontier and sending them off to Sicily to fight Vandals seemed like a really, really poor decision. Now just to get this out of the way, the Sassanid threat receded almost as quickly as it advanced. It is possible that their brief offensive against Roman positions in Armenia had been launched at the behest of Vandal ambassadors, who were looking to tie down Constantinople while Genseric moved to annex the province of Africa. But it appears that the Persian heart was never really in the attack, becoming embroiled in a major war with the Romans just so some ill-mannered barbarians could seize some land on the other side of the Mediterranean was no one's idea of good policy, and so the Sassanids withdrew almost as quickly as they had advanced. Not that the Vandals minded, if they really were behind the brief campaign. By that point, Constantinople had its hands full anyway, so Sassanid aggression was no longer required, because the Huns were feeling aggressive all on their own. The Huns had returned to the Danube frontier in force after 5 years of fruitless campaigning against the Persians. Likely hoping that they would be able to extract from the Sassanids the same sort of indemnity deal they'd already extracted from Constantinople, the Huns were now returning to the Hungarian plain disappointed men. I'm just speculating here, but I have to believe that 5 years' worth of futile campaigning in the east played a role in Bleda and Attila's posture towards the Romans when they returned. It seems reasonable that there would have been a fair amount of grumbling about the costly boondoggle the brother kings had just retreated from with nothing to show for it. How long would the brothers be tolerated if they didn't bring home some bacon, and soon? So in 441, the Huns crossed the Danube and began sacking Roman cities and towns. Make no mistake about it, this time there was no cover story about pursuing wayward vassals. This was a straight-up invasion of Roman territory with the intent of carting off any riches contained therein. Well, that's not exactly right. Carting off the riches contained therein was a nice bonus, but it's pretty clear that the attacks were mostly about forcing Constantinople to once again increase the annual indemnity it paid to the Huns. After all, attacks, campaigns, and battles risked Hun lives and treasure. But sitting around while the weak-willed and frightened Romans hand-delivered wagons full of gold, that risked almost nothing. So why conquer Rome when you can just turn it into a tax-paying vassal? So through 441 and 442, the Huns commenced a series of hit-and-run raids to remind Constantinople just how insecure their borders were, especially after they had foolishly sent that expedition off to the west to fight the Vandals. Driving the point home that this time the Huns really meant business, the strongest and most important cities of the upper Danube were targeted, including the old imperial capital of Sirmium, which the Huns stormed in the late summer of 442. The Romans attempted to resist, but having lost valuable resources to the expeditionary force, they were simply no match. The Hun army rolled right across Dacia and Moesia, sacking almost every major city along the way, which was, without question, the single most shocking and terrifying development to Roman war planners. You'll recall that the dynamic of the Gothic War after the Battle of Adrianople was that Fritigern and his Goths had the run of the open plains, but that they were unable to take any of the cities, since their siegecraft was real amateur-hour stuff. So as bad as it got, the Goths could never close the deal, a fact everyone eventually recognized, and a fact that led the Goths to finally accept Theodosius' peace overtures. So when the Huns first started pouring across the Danube, it is entirely likely that the Roman high command thought that the same rules would apply. Okay, we get the people and the food behind the walls, the Huns run around for a little while, it'll be rotten, but we'll get through it. But to their very great horror, the Huns breached the walls of the first city they hit, and then the next city they hit, and then the next city they hit. This is what really launched the Huns into being nightmarish monsters from hell. You couldn't hide from them anywhere. So far as I can tell, there is no obvious explanation for why the Huns were so much better at siegecraft than any other barbarian tribe. But they were, and there is speculation that their recurrent service with Aetius and the other Roman generals over the last 30 years had led them to pick up a trick or two. And though that may be the best rationale, it doesn't really explain why the Goths remained so rotten at breaking into walled cities after they had served in and around the Roman legions for the last 50 years. So it is a bit of a mystery why the Huns were able to crack the nut that so far no other barbarian nation had been able to crack. Even the Vandals down in North Africa owed their occupation of Carthage more to intimidation and betrayal than to brute force. Faced with the stark reality of Hun power, the wind went out of Theodosius II's sails. He absolutely had to get the Huns to stop their attacks. His armies couldn't stop them, his walls couldn't stop them, so it would have to be the cash. As I said, Attila and Bleda were not messing around this time, and after proving beyond any doubt that they could pretty much do whatever they want, whenever they wanted, it was going to cost the Romans to get them to stop doing whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted. For starters, that annual indemnity that you've been paying, cross out 700 pounds of gold and double it to 1,400 pounds of gold. Got it? Okay, next, we have captured just scads of prisoners. Really, we've got more of them than we know what to do with. Now we can either kill them, or we'll sell them back to you. Say at 12 solidi a head. A mere pittance, we agree, but we're feeling generous. So, are we all good here? Just go ahead and put the gold over there. There you go. That's a good little Roman. The Huns, temporarily good to their word, withdrew back across the Danube after the money was delivered. But the resulting peace cannot have felt at all secure to Constantinople. The Eastern legions had been utterly shown up. The defenses of key cities had been breached, and the economy of the Central Empire was thrashed and about to be overtaxed to pay the Huns to stay out. And perhaps most frightening of all, when you got right down to it, nothing more than a handshake prevented the Huns from just coming right back over the Danube. But the Huns were more honorable than the Romans perhaps gave them credit for, and they did indeed stay out of Roman territory for the next few years. It wouldn't be until the Romans broke the terms of the treaty that the Huns again launched themselves on an invasion. This time, one that would take them to the walls of Constantinople itself. While the Central Empire was being ravaged by the Huns, Flavius Aetius was doing his best to keep a handle on things in the West, which these days had less to do with thinking up sound laws and running a competent administration, and more to do with managing an increasingly complicated system of treaties with recent barbarian immigrants. In 442, when it became clear that no more help would be coming from the east thanks to the Hun invasion, Aetius was forced to formally recognize Vandal dominion over thinking, but it looks as though included in the treaty was a promise from the Vandals to continue the grain shipments to Italy, at least in part. Which makes sense when you think about it. The economy of North Africa revolved around supplying Italy with food. For Genseric to simply declare a trade embargo would have caused economic chaos in the lands he was now trying to rule, probably to the point that his new regime would have been fatally destabilized. Plus, cutting off the grain would have essentially forced Ravenna to launch a full-scale war against the Vandals, which was not at all in Genseric's best interests. But the deal did not just leave the status quo in place, because not accounted for in the treaty was the tax revenue generated by all that agricultural production and trade. That Genseric claimed for himself, cutting off yet another huge source of imperial revenue. So the Italians would not starve to death, but it was getting damn hard for them to afford stuff, like, standing armies. This revised treaty with the Vandals in place, Aetius spent the next few years in Gaul and Hispania, attempting to hold on to what little tax-paying territory Ravenna had left.